So without further ado, John and Nancy may be able to join us for questions and answers at the end, but I wanted to make sure that, that they got a chance to say hello to you today. Thank you so much to both of y'all. And now Sarah Anderson, one of my absolute favorite speakers from the Institute for Policy Studies. Sarah, I'm going to kick it over to you. We're excited to hear from you. You've been studying what these CEOs have been doing for the last years. I'm looking forward to learning something.
Yeah, I really enjoy talking about CEO pay because I can find common ground with pretty much everyone on this issue. It doesn't matter where people stand on the political spectrum. They are fed up with overpaid CEOs and the huge gaps between CEO and worker pay. And one of the people I always saw eye to eye on this topic with was my dad. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, and my dad ran a small children's clothing store on Main Street in my town. And he liked to point out that he and Sam Walton started their businesses the same year. Sam Walton, of course, is the founder of Walmart. And then my dad would go on to joke about how, from there, their paths kind of diverged a little bit, But I was thinking that by talking a little bit more about the stories of my dad and Sam Walton and what happened with their businesses, that I can say a lot about what's happened with our economy over the past half decade and who the big winners and losers have been. So I'm going to share my screen now. This is my dad in 1965 shoveling the sidewalk. And then I showed Sam Walton's first store. It looked quite similar. And then I was talking about how when I was small, my dad would often bring me with him when he went to wholesaler meetings in their showrooms in Minneapolis, because he figured I was a kid. He was selling kids' clothes. Maybe I'd have a good sense of what would be popular and sell. And one of his big lines was Oshkosh B'gosh. They make these really cute little bibbed overalls and things. And my dad really liked carrying this line. He thought it was really high quality. And it was a company that had been founded right next door to Minnesota in Wisconsin back in the 19th century. And but when I was with him one time, I remember him looking at the labels and seeing that it said made in Mexico. And he asked the salespeople about that. And they talked about how they were under a lot of pressure to slash costs. And so Oshkosh B'gosh had started moving production to low-wage countries where workers lacked their basic labor rights. And sure enough, in 1997, they closed down their last Wisconsin plant. Oshkosh B'gosh still exists, though. In fact, the clothes that they make look pretty similar to what they looked like when I was a little kid. But beyond that, most everything has changed. They're now owned by Carter's, which was another line my dad carried. And they don't make anything anymore. They don't own any factories. They source all of their products, mostly from suppliers in Asia. 80% of the fabric in their products comes from China, where average textile worker salaries are about $10,000. There are some textile jobs left in the US, but nothing like back in those days. And you can see average US textile worker pay is about $32,000. So higher than China, but still pretty low. And, that's not surprising since they are being pitted against workers in these low-wage countries. But the brand, the Oshkosh brand that was built up over all those years by a lot of hardworking people, it's still quite valuable. People still have very, fond associations with that brand. And so it's very valuable, at least for the people at the top. The CEO of Carter's, which owns Oshkosh B'gosh now, made $8.7 million in 2022. Median worker pay last year was $8,745. That was for someone who was a part-time clerk in one of their retail outlets. And so their gap between CEO and worker pay was 984 to 1. Levi's was another really big line for my dad to sell out of his children's clothing store. And he sold it for a long time, and then it just went crazy in the 70s and 80s. I don't know if people remember how insanely popular Levi's became. And Levi's started really squeezing small business owners and making it hard for them to sell Levi's. They set these minimum purchase orders. So at first, to hold on to it, my dad went in with another small store to pool their orders to make that minimum purchase. But then that other store closed, and eventually Levi's were really only sold through the big department stores after they really squeezed out the little guy. Then in 2003, Levi's kind of became the little guy because they decided they wanted to sell through Walmart. And by then, Walmart had become really huge. They had 4,688 stores. And so they'd become the big guy, and they started pressuring Levi's to slash their costs so they could have a bigger profit margin on those Levi's jeans and other products. And to do that, Levi's felt they had to shut down the rest of their US factories. So they laid off 2,000 people the first year they started selling out of Walmart. Levi's still sells out of Walmart today, but like Oshkosh B'gosh, they no longer manufacture anything. They don't have any of their own factories or anything. What they do is they take their label and put it on products made in countries where wages are low and workers often lack basic labor rights. And this model, again, it's been very profitable for people at the top because that Levi's brand is still so valuable, at least for the CEO. This is the Levi's CEO trying to look very, casual, like, regular guy there in his hoodie. He made 16 million last year. Median worker pay for Levi's, which I think is again one of their retail clerks, was about 21,000, and so their pay gap was 745 to 1. So that's how a couple of the product lines that my dad sold have done. What about my dad's store? Well, that's his former store there in the middle with the blank white sign. It's an empty storefront now. He made a decent living out of that small shop. He was middle-class living. He was able to put his kids into college. But once, Walmart moved in on the outside of town, and, today, of course, there's also Amazon competition. It's just become almost impossible to run a small retail operation like that on a small town main street. A lot of the stores in my hometown are now filled with social service agencies helping needy people. And I'm sure this looks familiar to people from a lot of other small towns. So, how are people done at Walmart? Well, they have a very big gap between CEO and worker pay. Last year, the Walmart CEO made more than 25 million. And that was 933 times as much as the typical worker made last year. That was $27,000 for median worker pay at Walmart. More on how workers are doing. Walmart is the largest employer of workers who have to rely on public assistance to get by because wages are so low. I gave a version of this presentation in Whiteville, North Carolina, where Patriotic Millionaires is doing a pilot project for the Great Economy Dialogues. And I pointed out that in North Carolina alone, 3,500 Walmart employees were receiving food stamps in 2020. On the top end, it's worth pointing out that, it's not just about all the money flooding up to the top of the economic pyramid, it's also about power. Sam Walton's heirs are now the world's richest family, and they have a foundation that's given hundreds of thousands of dollars to organize that lobby against raising taxes on the wealthy. They donate millions of dollars to political candidates. And so, like I said, this issue of the concentration of wealth at the top also means concentration of power at the top. So a little bit more about why our CEO to worker pay gap so huge. Well, I already talked about the offshoring trend and how that has really undercut good jobs in the US. That's part of a broader trend of just declining worker power. with the related decline in unionization and rise of anti-union laws. And Eric already showed this similar chart here. One clear sign of declining worker power is the disconnect now between productivity and wages. For decades, when productivity went up, workers could count on their wages going up as well. They got more of a fair reward for that increased productivity. But in the 70s and especially starting in the 80s, that wasn't true anymore. Workers didn't have the clout to really demand and negotiate for a fair reward from rising productivity. Another reason for the huge gaps between CEO and worker pay are the kinds of shenanigans that CEOs can pull to inflate their own paychecks. Most CEO compensation is in some form of stock-based pay. And so one thing they can do is stock buybacks. And when a company buys back their stock, it raises the price of their shares, and that artificially inflates the value of the CEO's stock-based pay while siphoning resources from worker wages. So I've got here the spending by S&P 500 companies on stock buybacks in recent years. Last year, it was over $900 billion. It could hit $1 trillion this year. And every dollar that is spent on stock buybacks is a dollar that's not spent on worker wages or research and development or other kinds of investments that could be good for a company in the long term. To give an example of how this plays out in specific companies, we looked at Lowe's, the big home improvement store chain. In 2021, they spent $13 billion on stock buybacks. With that amount of money, they could have given every one of their 325,000 employees a $40,000 raise. Instead, at Lowe's, median pay fell 7.6% to $22,000 and change. You often hear, well, we have a pay for performance system for CEOs. And I just want to underscore what a total myth that is. Another way that CEOs get huge unearned windfalls is when the value of their stock goes up for reasons that have nothing to do with their own individual performance. And probably the most dramatic example of that would be the oil executives. Here we've got the ExxonMobil CEO. The value of his stock holdings in ExxonMobil went from 42.6 million at the end of 2020 and jumped up to 138.6 million in the fall of 2022. Well, was that because he just was extraordinarily, innovative or inspiring? What was it that made that huge jump in his wealth? No, it had to do with things that he had no control over, the war in Ukraine, the supply chain issues, and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, he was personally extremely well rewarded. Even when CEOs perform poorly by pretty much every measure, they often get huge payouts. One example of that would be last November, Disney fired their CEO. And during his 2 years on the job, stock prices had dropped 27%. Thousands of workers at Disney lost their jobs. Theme park tickets spiked. And he still walked away with $44 million payout. Often the boards that make these kind of decisions over CEO pay are made up of CEOs or executives of other companies or other people who have some vested interest in not challenging this insane system of overpaying our CEOs. So what do Americans think about this? Well, like I said in the beginning, I've always been able to find common ground with pretty much everyone I meet on this issue. And polling really bears this out. There was a poll by Just Capital last year, and one question they asked was, are CEOs of large US companies compensated too much or the right amount? And the percentage of people who said they're paid too much it was 71% of Republicans, 81% of Democrats. Huge, huge majorities. Didn't matter which party. This was the most interesting question of the poll for me. They asked people, should there be a maximum amount CEOs are compensated relative to the average worker? This is a pretty, radical idea, just like capping CEO pay relative to worker pay. And again, astounding results here. 62% of Republicans and even larger shares of Democrats and independents think we should just cap it, just cap CEO pay. So what can we do about these huge gaps between the top and the bottom of our corporate ladders? Well, I think we need to both level up the bottom and level down the top. We can level up the bottom by things like raising the minimum wage, allowing workers to bargain collectively for better pay and benefits, requiring companies that receive any taxpayer funds to create good jobs. And like I said, we need to level down the top as well. Think about, the Walton family and all that political power they have. If we don't do something to address that concentration of power and money at the top, it's going to be really hard to win the kind of policy and other changes that we need to have an economy that really works for all of us. So, in the Patriotic Millionaires crowd, it's nothing new to say we need to raise taxes on the rich. We should also address the stock buybacks problem, and there is some momentum around that. We now have a small tax on stock buybacks. President Biden spoke about it in his State of the Union and called for quadrupling that tax on stock buybacks. We could also just ban them like they were before 1982, and then CEOs wouldn't have this clever little scam that they can use to inflate their own pay. We can also tackle these pay gaps directly. We could make corporations with huge gaps pay a higher corporate tax rate, and there are bills to do that in both the House and the Senate. We could also, use the power of the public purse to give a leg up in federal contracting to companies with narrow pay gaps. So these are just a few of the ideas I have. I'm sure you have many more, but it does seem that, people have had enough of executive excess. They want solutions. They're even for support very bold solutions. And we need to, stop the disconnect between people on the ground and those here in Washington, where I live, who make the decisions on these things. So if you want to stay in touch, so I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, and we have a website called inequality.org. And a related newsletter. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at this link.